Hi, everybody. Welcome to this second plenary session of the ADAPT International Labour Organization International Conference. I'm Margherita Roiatti, Senior Researcher in ADAPT, and I will chair this important session, which is the institutional panel. We have 4 eminent speakers providing their contributions today. We have 3 in presence and 1 joining us online. You will meet Christina in a few minutes. Thank you for joining us in this hybrid format. And now I'll provide a brief presentation of our speakers today, and then I will leave them the floor for providing their speeches. And at the end of all speeches, we will have about 10 minutes for a question and answer session for your remarks and your inputs after these interesting presentations. So today with me, there are Ilaria Armaroli, Bettina Schaller, Sten Broek, is it correct? Okay. And Christina Bernd from the ILO. Ilaria Armaroli is a colleague of mine in ADAPT, and I'm quite proud of having her today in this plenary session. Ilaria received a PhD in labor relation at the University of Bergamo. Her research focus is specifically related to industrial relations, collective bargaining, and employee voice. Thanks to her propensity to the field research, she has developed experience in getting along with social partners and cooperating with them in training, consultancy, and research activities, both at national and European level. She has an international profile since she has been working in several research projects co-funded by the European Commission by producing articles and reports in the field of industrial relations, social dialogue, and collective bargaining, as well as by organizing training activities and international events. Bettina Schaller oversees the ADECO Group's public affairs activities, as a group of senior VP of public affairs. She's also president of the World Employment Confederation, which is one of the main sponsors of this conference, where she drives the strategic realignment of the organization. She's a founding member of the boardroom, a Swiss initiatives aimed at driving board diversity and developing the pipeline of future women leaders. In addition, she's a member of the B20 Employment and Education Task Force, co-chair of the Organization for the Economic Cooperation and Development Business, and vice chair of business on the OECD Employment, Labor and Social Affairs Committee, and a steering group member of the World Economic Forum Center for the New Economy and Society. In 2017, 2018, 2018, she was named a Staffing 100 Europe influencer and into the international 50 of the Global Power 100 Women in Staffing Industry. Recently, and since 2017, she has been recognized among the leading ladies of the workforce solutions industry. After Bettina Schaller's speech, we will have the one from Sten Broek. Sten Broek is a senior economist at the OECD, where he leads the organization Future of Work initiative. Currently, he manages a large research program on the impact of the artificial intelligence on the labor market. He holds an MPhil in development studies from the University of Cambridge and a PhD in economics from the Royal Holloway University of London. He has over 15 years experience working in government and international organizations. During the time, he has worked on a wide range of topics, including health, pensions, child poverty, higher education, youth employment, minimum wages, and skills. And last but not least, we have Christina from the ILO, which is the organization who is helping us in partnership of organizing this 3 days conference, the one again in presence after the COVID-19 situation. Christina is head of the social policy unit in the International Labour Office, Social Protection Department in Geneva. Her work experience included assignments as regional social security specialist at the ILO Regional Office for the Arab States in Beirut, as consultant at the International Social Security Association, and as a lecturer and research fellow at the University of Constance. She has worked and published on various aspects of social security in both developing and developing countries. Having studied in Constance in Edinburgh, she earned her master's degree in politics and public administration and her PhD in social policy from the University of Constance. She has widely published on social protection in both developed and developing countries, including on social assistance and other cash transfer, the extension of social protection to those in the informal economy, income distribution and poverty alleviation, as well as the distributive effects of various social protection benefits on poverty and inequality. She has also contributed to ILO World Social Protection Reports, and she will focus on this topic during her presentation today. So without further ado, I will leave the floor to Ilaria for her speech, and I will also upload her presentation. Here we are, Ilaria.
Thank you very much, Margherita, for your introduction. And my presentation will be just an overview, an attempt to link and to outline the role, the possible role that industrial relations can play for the value of work. And within this presentation, also to describe the action of ADAPT, the organization I am part of, within this interplay between industrial relations and the value of work. So no one has ever argued that labor problems in a market economy constituting the foundation raison d'etre of industrial relations in Bruce Kaufman's argument no longer exist. Even the 90s prospects of the end of paid work have gone no farther, although post-capitalism utopias are finding fertile ground in current crisis times. More concretely, the COVID-19 pandemic has done nothing but put the human dimension of labor and its related problems in the academic and public spotlight once again. Work and its value have been addressed from different perspectives. Some authors have cast light on systemically valuable, though economically undervalued, services workers, like cleaners, caregivers, warehouse workers, and delivery agents. Others have pointed to the increased workload and technological surveillance, as well as to the weakened relational dimension of the work performed by people compelled to work from home. More recently, labor shortages in traditionally precarious and low-paid occupational fields like retail and restaurants have been attributed to the re-evaluation of work-related goals and plans performed by individuals in Western countries after the outbreak of the pandemic. A large part of today's labor problems, which the COVID-19 has just contributed to exacerbating, can be reconducted to the creation, acknowledgement, and redistribution of the value at work. On closer inspection, it is exactly by fulfilling these goals that industrial relations, as both a problem-solving approach and a field of study, have traditionally found their ideological justification in market economies. The field of employment relations involves the study of employment, with a focus on how labor and management combine to create value and negotiate over its division, as well as how people experience the workplace. The value which industrial relations have allowed to create over time is not merely economic, in terms of both profits for employers and wages for employees. It is not even simply systemic for capitalist economies to survive and function thanks to the meeting between the supply and demand of goods and services. By connecting and representing people collectively, as well as by advancing rights and opportunities for workers' assemblies, discussions, and mutual aid activities in workplaces, trade unions have contributed to building and sustaining the social and relational value of work. By introducing clauses on issues such as workers' training, career path, and participation in decision-making processes, collective bargaining has supported the value of work as a source of personal and professional identity. Overall, by instilling elements of solidarity and collective governance in workplaces, industrial relations have helped humans enjoy concrete experiences of freedom and personal fulfillment, which is indeed impossible outside of and apart from communal life. Not to mention the contribution of trade unions and industrial relations to political participation and citizen engagement in democratic public processes, as well as to workers' entitlement of economic and social rights by virtue of their membership in the employment relationship. In other words, recalling John Budd's famous conceptualizations of work, industrial relations have served for a long time to release work from being just a curse, a necessary burden for human survival and maintenance, and a commodity, an abstract quantity of productive effort which can be bought and sold in the market. Though accepting capitalist social relations and leaving related structural inequalities unchanged, industrial relations in their pluralist conceptualization have contributed to partly giving back to work its human face, that is its value as a natural human instinct, spurring identity formation, personal fulfillment, and more broadly, human and environmental conservation and regeneration. In this regard, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Maria Montessori, the Italian physician and educator known worldwide for having revolutionized child development and education in the first half of the 20th century. I have run into her only recently, after the birth of my first child, while I was looking for useful educational hints and suggestions. During one of my random searches, I was particularly impressed by her views on work and human development. In her 1936 book, The Secret of Childhood, the author does more than assigning work a fundamental role for personal satisfaction, development, and fulfillment, and for the safeguard of our economies and societies. Conceiving it as an attitude connatural to individuals since childhood, Montessori places human work within a broader universal plan, according to which all living beings' activities would be oriented not simply to their own survival, but also to Earth's conservation and regeneration. Corals build islands and continents by reconstructing coasts broken up by the incessant action of the waves. Insects transmit plant pollen while retaining much of the plant life. The condor and the hyena purify the environment of unburied corpses. Other animals remove debris. Others make honey and wax. Others silk, and so on. The mission of life is so immense and essential that the earth is preserved thanks to life embracing the globe with a layer equivalent to the atmosphere. Animals produce more than what their needs require. Their activity always results in a surplus, which is immensely greater than the direct needs of conservation. Therefore, they are all workers of the universe and observers of universal laws. Man, worker par excellence, cannot escape from these laws. Montessori's insights into the meaning of work from an environmental perspective gain a new relevance in what is today acknowledged as the Anthropocene age. As we all know very well, though, the enforcement of the universal laws which Montessori talks about, and according to which Earth is preserved and regenerates itself, thanks to all living beings' activities, cannot be taken for granted. And nowadays, the sustainability of human work from an environmental perspective, an issue largely neglected in the past, is one of the most crucial test benches for industrial relations. Overall, in the light of current transformations, industrial relations are urgently prompted not to give up with their original task of humanizing work. After all, labor is only another name for a human activity which goes with life itself, which in its turn is not produced for sale, but for entirely different reasons, nor can that activity be detached from the rest of life, be stored or mobilized. For industrial relations today, this popular Polanyi's quote translates into a number of concrete goals. Among these, we can list, firstly, to acknowledge and strengthen the historically overlooked environmental value of paid work by orienting social partners to accompany and support greening and just transitions in workplaces against the threats that climate change is dramatically issuing to human work and life. We can all agree with the International Union slogan, "There are no jobs on a dead planet." Secondly, to offset the individualization trends in times of remote work, fragmented career paths, and rising periphery and multicultural workforce by enriching the social, relational, and identity dimensions of paid work, and therefore by boosting individual guidance and assistance, as well as collective regulation in terms of rights and opportunities for workers' participation in decision-making processes, mutual aid initiatives, skills development, and the smooth occupational transitions, both within and outside workplaces. This means deconstructing the liberal traditions trade-off between individual autonomy and communal solidarity by unleashing the potential of the latter to nurture the capacity of every individual to experience self-realization, which is in many ways defined only in relationship with others. Thirdly, to tackle the problems of low-paid work by finding new ways to assess the economic value of work, especially whereby, such as in creative and care industries, units of time and technical skills are not the main criteria for measuring work well done. Fourthly, to acknowledge, respect, and preserve reproductive and domestic work, which is not market-mediated and yet extremely and increasingly functional in the age of demographic change, to our economy and societies by striking really sustainable balances between work, both paid and unpaid, health and life. I am glad and honored on behalf of ADAPT Scientific Committee and governing bodies that the contributions which were already presented yesterday and will be presented and discussed today and tomorrow at ADAPT ILO International Conference address many of these ambitious objectives. Returning to my initial point, therefore, it cannot be said that industrial relations have lost their ideological foundation. The human essence of labor and the rejection of the neoclassical assumption of perfectly competitive and problem-free labor markets are largely unquestioned. Nor can one claim that the balancing approach underpinning pluralist industrial relations lacks its reasons in today's market economies. Competing interests and uneven power relations emerge even more clearly along current vertically disintegrated production processes, whereby organizational and geographical capital mobility serves efficiency goals, often to the detriment of workers' equity needs, which largely rely on context-specific normative obligations not free from loopholes. Not to mention today's pressing need to balance ethical and data protection concerns with cost-effectiveness rationales in the growing deployment of artificial intelligence systems in workplaces. To address such systemic nodes and imbalances, business remedies driven by the unitarist logics of corporate social responsibility or stakeholder capitalism, while helping raise companies' awareness of their social and environmental accountability, mostly fail to provide long-term commitments and global responses on their own. On the other hand, radical or critical approaches intended to redress workers' problems by building their collective power have been blamed for largely overlooking work dimensions going beyond the economic exchange relationship, as well as lacking sufficient realism to build concrete programs and solutions. But if alternative perspectives to pluralist industrial relations have proved not to be satisfying by themselves, we cannot neglect the serious legitimacy crisis affecting traditional industrial relations institutions and players, such as trade unions, collective bargaining, and labor law, and the emergence and spread of new ones, like worker centers, labor NGOs, corporate social responsibility, multilateral international institutions, and so on. From different sides, industrial relations are called to integrate their original concerns about competing and shared interests in direct employment relationships with a number of increasingly interconnected issues encompassing intersectional personal identities, investors and consumers as indirect employers and new influential actors, families, communities, and the environment as both impacting on and being impacted by work relations. The impression is that work is a too complex, multifaceted, and multi-stakeholder experience to limit industrial relations research and practice to direct and bilateral employer-employee relationships. In Duke's and Streck's words, being not only a commodity exchanged for wages, but a part of social life, human work cannot be fully subsumed under contract or competition law, since social life is also cooperative, not for sale, and dependent on social norms that provide essential pre-contractual conditions of contract. It is the whole past century's social contract which is questioned here, since by grounding its vision of work, as well as the provision of economic and social protections on rigid theoretical and institutional categories like legal subordination, bilateral employment relationships, male breadwinners, and so on, it has ended up struggling to provide proper solutions to the new problems of labor, which continuously overstep those constructs. In face of such challenges, ADAPT, founded in 2000 by Professor Marco Biagi with the aim of promoting studies and research in the fields of labor law and industrial relations, does not have decisive answers, but at best, just a humble idea to approach them. Firstly, by treasuring and further cultivating the empirical method of early 20th century American institutionalists, and therefore by carefully analyzing real-world actors and practices. The annual ADAPT report on the developments of collective bargaining in Italy, currently in its 8th edition, fits with this approach, along with the various researches and studies conducted yearly by ADAPT in partnership with public institutions, enterprises, social partners, and universities. Secondly, and partly connected with these, by acknowledging, embodying, and voicing as many intellectual approaches and sensitivities to daily reality of work as possible. ADAPT was indeed founded and still characterizes itself as an association intended to gather members from various bodies and organizations, like public institutions, trade unions, enterprises, and business associations, thus mirroring the tripartite composition of Dunlop's industrial relations system. This in an effort to provide a neutral and independent field for freely discussing and collectively building the future of work. Thirdly, by valuing and honoring what was traditionally considered as both the strength and weakness of industrial relations, which is the lack of a closed paradigm and yet the integration of multiple disciplines. ADAPT team gathers postgraduate and doctoral students, research apprentices, and postdoc and senior researchers with backgrounds in labor law, philosophy, sociology, communication, and political sciences. Thirdly, by taking up Hazard and Bjorkman's suggestion to engage with more interventionist approaches to industrial relations research, ADAPT International School of Higher Education in Labor Law and Industrial Relations promotes higher education and doctoral path in concrete work environments, such as HR, IR departments in private companies, employers and trade union organizations, private employment agencies, research and education institutes, and so on, where students co-create their research agenda on relevant labor topics and have the opportunity to act as change agents in industrial relations dynamics. Fifthly, by adopting and enhancing an international perspective to the study of work in a globalized world. This explains ADAPT participation in several European Union co-funded projects and cross-country initiatives, some of these conducted in the past with many of your universities and research centers, and hopefully in the future, also with those of you who have joined our international conference for the first time this year. The adoption of an international perspective, moreover, underlies ADAPT promotion of the e-journal of International and Comparative Labor Studies and the international research community Cielo Laboral, as well as the organization of annual international conferences on crucial labor topics like the one which is taking place now. Fitting into and further promoting this broader approach to labor challenges, this 11th edition of ADAPT International Conference is intended to stimulate and share among academics, experts, and practitioners from different backgrounds scientific contributions on how to rethink work and its value. In the conviction that if industrial relations still serve a purpose in today's changing society, this must be the promotion of a balanced, inclusive, and sustainable approach to social development, which cannot but embed work, consuming so much of our daylight hours, conferring income and status, and shaping life chances in so many ways. So I wish all of you a happy ADAPT ILO International Conference, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Ilaria, for providing us with a lot of food for thoughts for this international conference, and also for the hard work behind this this speech. Again, we will have time for question and answers and remarks about each presentation at the end of the panel. And now I'll leave the floor to Bettina Schaller.
Thank you so much, Margherita, and thank you so much, Ilaria. What a beautiful 20 minutes. You took me to a completely different world there with Maria Montessori, of course, so really appreciate that. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you. It's probably the fourth time for me in the last 6 years. And to be honest, I feel that I recognize some old friend. The thing is, behind the mask, I can't actually recognize if we've met before, but for sure, always a pleasure to be here with you. World Employment Confederation. So we are that other partner that you mentioned, that private sector, the enterprise partner. And of course, it's been an absolute pleasure to be teaming up with you, with ADAPT, and also with the ILO in the context of this conference, but also throughout the year. We notably together publish a newsletter, which we're very proud of, and gives continuity, of course, to the important work that is being done by all of us, I would say. World Employment Confederation is the voice of labor market enablers. So we're about private employment services, the solutions that both workers and companies need in the labor market. And that spans everything from training, reskilling, upskilling, career guidance, outsourcing, of course, and yes, the staffing piece, whether it's flexible or permanent, and the whole recruitment and selection as well. So I've come here today to share with you the insights, which are going to be a bit more pragmatic indeed, and which are going to be about, snippets of what we see the labor market looks like right now, and importantly, of how we see that this sector creates more value for the world of work. Let's first look at the labor markets, and let's do so by, as I said, a few snippets here and there. So first of all, what do those labor markets in the new normal right now look like? Is it the Great Resignation? The numbers are clear. 41% of workers are considering leaving their jobs. What we see, though, at the same time is unemployment rates are dropping, getting very close to pre-crisis levels. Interestingly, though, quits rates are rising to levels not seen in many years before. There is one big element that we see out there for labor markets, and actually I'm going to ask the room what you think that is, the one big trend we see right now. And we see that actually all over the world. Even though I'm making a disclaimer here, we're going to talk a lot about the developed world here, labor markets in basically the Western Hemisphere. But what do you think, and I'm calling on you, what is this one thing that we see all over right now in labor markets? Anybody? It is scarcity. It is shortages. We see that that is the #1 issue right now out there for employers. As you see here, in the 15 countries presented in this outlook, employers report record high hiring plans for the current quarter. And simultaneously, 69% of employers across 43 countries report difficulties in hiring which is a 15-year high. What's absolutely fascinating is that those shortages affect all sectors. We see that pretty much all industries are looking for workers right now. Of course, it's especially those sectors that have been impacted most by the containment measures. And those are, as you can see here, the fastest and strongest increase where we see in the accommodation and food service activities, the HoReCa, construction, manufacturing, and industry and construction services. In those sectors, demand for workers surged as they were opened up again following the peak lockdown period, and the supply cannot keep up. The vacancy rate in these sectors is nearly 30% higher in Q2 2021 than it was in Q2 2019 pre-crisis. There's of course other pandemic-related factors that also play a role here, and it's important to mention them, such as, well, the fear of actually catching the disease. We're seeing a lot of people not returning to the labor market, and we'll get to that just because of COVID itself. We've seen the effects of restriction in worker migration, the mobility piece with closed borders. Then again, quite a few workers were able to build up savings, so why should they return to work right now? And then there's the job retention schemes. We see in many countries, they have had a tremendous impact in terms of security, of course, and the phasing out, of course, has not started yet, leading to that scarcity on the labor market. Of course, unemployment rates don't capture the full extent of the impact of the pandemic and the containment measures on the labor market. At global level, it is estimated that more than 70% of the employment loss during the crisis is attributed to people becoming inactive. And here you see that we took the liberty, and I'm sure Christina might mention that as well, to showing you data from the International Labour Organization, from the ILO, where you see that the working loss hours in 2020, which amounted to 8.8%, were both the combination of working hour reduction within employment and, of course, employment loss. And within that employment loss, it's the shift to unemployment and to the shift to inactivity, which actually makes the biggest piece. So those people at global level, it is estimated, as I said, 70% of the employment loss during the crisis is attributed to people becoming inactive. Those people lost their work and are not actively searching for new employment. Labor force participation has therefore dropped more than significantly than unemployment rates have risen specifically. I think an interesting one to remember for us. So what keeps people away from work? While for many workers, this is of course not a choice, for others, it's a decision. Their evaluation of work has changed. We're talking about value here. It's about the evaluation of work, which has changed. The salary, of course, remains a major factor in people's consideration for leaving their current job. But other factors play a key role as well. Whether it's better work-life balance, the pandemic may have reset their priorities, boundaries have become blurred, at least for those in teleworkable occupations, and the realization that life is precious has really risen. Most workers globally believe their prospects for finding jobs will actually improve in the future. So looking at the current labor shortage and the fact that people are able to fall back on built-up savings, well, they might just be holding out with the expectation that better opportunities will arise. As we said, money is no longer the only motivation in work. It is not the only factor in people's decision to respond to a job offer. Security, employers' values, purpose, progression opportunities, autonomy, and very important, flexibility are growing in importance. 3 out of 4 workers globally do not want to lose the flexible ways of working that they have become accustomed to over the last 2 years. 2 in 5 workers are considering moving to a job with more flexible options. less than half are satisfied with the current career prospects at their employer. Of course, it's not just about flexibility. Employees are also expecting more from their employers regarding well-being, professional development, management, perks, and so on. In a nutshell, they have a lot of expectations for their work to make them happy. So perhaps it's not so much a great resignation, but rather a great re-evaluation of the world of work, as people re-evaluate what work means to them. After these snippets of the labor market, let me now share with you what the HR services, the private employment services industry does to create more value. Indeed, employers need to take workers' re-evaluation of values into account and meet their expectations in order to ensure healthy labor force participation. This is exactly where the HR services industry is part of the set of solutions. At its core, it has the mission to improve the value of labor markets for society, for workers, and for businesses. For society, the industry helps reduce unemployment, it improves matching processes and speed, and it develops innovative social solutions. For businesses, the industry offers access to needed talent and helps them to manage risks. For workers, the industry facilitates access to safe, decent, and quality job. It delivers career guidance and skilling. It supports inclusive labor markets, and it offers a wide range of work arrangements that cater for the diverse work-life balance expectations. The mission of the industry is therefore reflected in these 5 messages. We support the transition to new economies. We drive social purpose and social innovation. We simplify the increasing labor market complexity. We act as a solution provider in terms of risk management, and we deliver responsible intermediation and make job markets work. Now, let me demonstrate how the industry delivers all of these with a few examples. First of all, and you see it's key by us mentioning that first, the industry creates value through up and reskilling. The industry plays a critical role in keeping people attached to the labor market. The OECD estimates that half of all adults are not engaged in adult learning. The pandemic and digitalization amplifies this challenge, as there will be increasing needs for workers to move to new occupations or sectors. Each year, millions of workers around the world take advantage of training schemes offered by the HR services industry. Career management and career guidance services, part of the HR services industry, are also becoming increasingly critical in facing the need for worker transitions. Globally, job-to-job transitions are on average 30 to 50% quicker when a career management firm is involved. About enabling those career transitions, this is where the industry plays a critical role in keeping people attached to the labor market. 72% of agency workers remain in employment after having started out with a job in the industry. They may move on to other employment arrangements, or they are converted to direct employees at the companies they'd been placed by the HR services company. We know that more than 1/5 of agency workers are taken on by the client company. Let me come to this driving social purpose element. Indeed, the industry plays a key role in bringing unemployed and inactive, and you remember that incredible number mentioned before about inactive people in the labor market right now. Well, this industry brings inactive workers, potential workers, back into the labor market. 35% of agency workers were in non-employment before taking jobs provided by the HR services industry. This clearly highlights the key role in raising labor force participation. Let's look now at the opportunities for underrepresented groups. Young people, they have been suffering disproportionately from this pandemic. The number of NEET, not in employment and education or training, increased by 3 million across the OECD as a result of the pandemic. In many countries, the share of young people in jobs provided by the HR industry is higher than the share of young in the overall employed population. This highlights clearly the crucial role of the industry for young people and students who may be looking for their first entry point into the labor market. We talked about social innovation, and this is absolutely crucial more and more. It's about creating value by guaranteeing the rights for workers. We will hear more about this specifically from Christina, but here, let me focus on how the specific agency work industry is contributing. And you see here the results of a comparative approach that we have taken. Social protection access has been highlighted as the major challenge during the pandemic. As we know, self-employed workers have been impacted the strongest, often having no effective access to benefits. Steen, you will talk about this. Regarding statutory access to social protection benefits, it is clear that employed workers enjoy significantly higher levels of access to unemployment benefits, to sick leave, to health insurance, etc., than self-employed workers. However, in terms of effective access to social protection benefits, there is a significant gap between employees on open-ended, full-time contracts, and all other types of workers. This is a challenge that requires the re-evaluation of the social contract to ensure basic levels of protection for all. The World Employment Confederation advocates for basic safety nets for all workers, irrespective of their employment status. Social innovation is key here, and the HR services industry has developed various schemes across the world that can serve as a good practice here. The interesting element to you is that the private employment services industry actually goes beyond. Agency workers often benefit from sectoral supplementary provisions in order to top up their effective access to benefits. Social partners engage in collective bargaining and develop sectoral funds and solutions that benefit the workers. These can be portable rights to improve access to safety nets, training funds, or schemes to improve workers' health insurance access. The OECD recognized that the outcomes of these collective bargaining exercises often results in more generous provisions being available to agency workers than to regular employees on fixed-term contracts. Let me now take a little bit of a higher perspective here and just also look at how the sector creates value by contributing to overall economic growth. Because this industry plays a key role in labor markets and economies. We talked about the raising labor market participation and the lowering unemployment role. That contributes clearly to inclusive growth and inclusive labor markets. The activity in the sector has always been highly cyclical due to the nature of the industry. It is an early indicator of where the economy is heading. We've seen this even during the current crisis. In the first quarter of 2021, the GDP growth in the EU remained negative year on year, although close to beginning the recovery, while the agency work activity had already picked up then, growing positively in the same quarter, signaling the turnaround point. When comparing across countries, we can also see a clear correlation between the share of agency workers among the working population and unemployment, and that correlation is a negative one, which is positive. You'll remember that. It indicates that countries with a higher share of workers employed by the HR services industry have lower unemployment rates. And at the same time, we know that the industry raises formal employment, providing legally recognized labor contracts. We thus observe this significant negative correlation between the share of agency workers and the level of informal employment across countries. Ladies and gentlemen, let me come to the end. Labor markets were already undergoing significant and deep transformations before the COVID-19 crisis hit. Clearly, it only accelerated this change. As we have seen, expectations are changing. And as the theme of this conference rightly points to, the value of work is changing. As private employment services, we play a key role in helping people and organizations redefine that value of work and adapt to new realities. As with everything, we need to have a clear view, though, on the situation and the trends, and that's where the research plays a key role. I'm thus absolutely delighted again to be here with you, our longstanding partners, such a valuable network of researchers and of thinkers looking to work together to advance our common knowledge on the world of work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bettina, for this insightful presentation about the role of HR services industry in creating a more valuable work, and also for cross-quoting both the OECD and also the ILO. Perfect work.
Pure coincidence.
Pure coincidence. So now the word to our OECD representative in this institutional panel. So I leave the floor to the next presentation, which will focus on how to protect vulnerable self-employed workers in the platform economy and beyond.
Thank you very much, Margarita. So my presentation will focus on a group of workers who, to talk about the theme of the conference, I think are a group of workers who are highly valuable, but not always highly valued. And they're workers with very few rights and protections, even though they are vulnerable workers. What I'm specifically talking about here is a subgroup of own account workers or self-employed workers without employees. I think before I start, it's useful to think about them as platform workers. This is the obvious example that comes to mind: delivery riders, share ride drivers. But there's also examples outside the platform economy. In some countries, hairdressers or plumbers or truck drivers also work along those lines. They work as own account workers. But what I will argue is that they are vulnerable in some ways, and they do not always receive the rights and protections that they, I think, should be entitled to. So many of these, we've been warning about this issue even before the crisis. And obviously the crisis showed, as Bettina just said, that these workers were highly, highly vulnerable. And countries often scrambled emergency measures together to try and support these workers, often effectively so. But it does make us think about, let's think about the long run. Let's make this more sustainable. So what I want to do in my presentation is give you a framework for thinking about who these workers are, what the sources of vulnerability are, and as a result, what should be done about it. And what I think what is really important, or one point that I want to bring across in my presentation, is that sometimes I feel that the emphasis is too much on employment status. I think employment status is important, but it's not the only reason for vulnerability among those workers. And I think that's very important, because the source of vulnerability will have an impact on the policy implications. And so as a policymakers, if you want to do something about and improve the rights and protections of these workers, you first of all need to identify what the source of the vulnerability is. And so in my view, there are three sources of possible vulnerability of these workers. One is the obvious one that's often talked about, which is misclassification of workers. The second source is kind of related to the classification issue and to the employment status issue. And that's workers who are left somewhere in between being a self-employed worker or an employee. So it's kind of related to the classification issue, but in practice, in many countries, once the classification issue is solved, people who are in the gray zone are kind of forgotten about. But the third source of vulnerability, I would argue, is monopsony power. And I think there are self-employed workers who are proper self-employed workers, but who find themselves in a position where they have very little bargaining power and very few outside options vis-a-vis their clients or their employers. And I think if that is the case, the policy solutions are very different from the first and two cases. Of course, I don't think these are mutually exclusive categories. I think in many cases, workers will face variants or all three of them together. So let's start with the classification issue, the employment status issue. As you probably know, I mean, in Italy is no exception to this. There's been a lot of court cases around the status of some of the employment status of some of these workers. Are they employees or are they self-employed workers? And I just want to remind you of why there's so much at stake in these court cases. In most countries, if you're an employee, you're covered by labor market regulation. So what does that mean? You have employment protection. You cannot be fired from one day to the next. You often have to give people an advance warning. Often there's severance pay. So there's all sorts of, you can't fire anybody for any reason. There's all sorts of regulations around the dismissal of workers. If you're an employee, you're also covered obviously by minimum wage legislation. You're covered by working time. So you have a right to holidays. You have a right to switch off at a certain point of time. Anti-discrimination tends to cover most self-employed workers in most countries as well. Bettina's already referred to social protection. In most countries, self-employed workers have some social protection, but not quite the same as employees. So they might have some pensions, although often it's not the same level of pensions. They often do not have access to unemployment insurance. So when they lose their source of income, they're left to their own devices. In some cases, they're not even covered for accident, sickness, and invalidity insurance. Parental benefits tend to be more universal. The third right that, and I think we've already heard about this from Ilaria as well, is that if you're an employee, you have a collective bargaining right. So a union will represent you, and a union can bargain on your behalf and get better working conditions and wage as a result. Whereas if you're a self-employed person, you are treated by competition law as a business. So you have no right to collective bargaining, because that would be, unfair competition. You'd be setting rates and it would be collusion. I've mentioned skills here as well, just in passing, because to some extent, skills training policies sometimes benefit the employees more than the self-employed as well. So clearly, a lot is at stake when you talk about employment status, and that's why there's been so many court cases around this. Now, so this misclassification, I think some of these workers are misclassified. There's no doubt about it. Now, how do you deal with this? I think sometimes the rules and regulations need to be clarified. I think sometimes the rules and regulations need to be updated. Sometimes it's also just a matter of communicating them. It might be that workers and employers are not very clear about what the rules and regulations are. It may be a genuine mistake. So clarifying this is very important, and also updating the rules so that they reflect the current reality. So through this, you're trying to make this group of misclassified workers as small as possible. For a worker, it's also very difficult to challenge their employment status. You're an individual vis-a-vis an organization very often, and there's a lot at stake. It's often very costly. So making it easier and cheaper for workers to challenge their employment status is also something that's going to help with the misclassification of workers. So reversing the burden of proof is something that I will come to in the next slide as well. Reducing court fees, simplifying procedures, protecting workers against potential retaliation from employers. These are all things that will make it easier for workers to challenge their employment status. It also helps if unions or labor authorities can take cases to court on behalf of workers. Again, because it's for a worker, there's so much at stake. It's so costly and time consuming to take your case to court as an individual. You can strengthen the labor inspectors and make them work together with tax authorities, because tax authorities clearly have an incentive to correctly classify workers. And I'll come back to that in a second. You can also strengthen penalties for firms that misclassify workers deliberately, and especially firms who do so repeatedly over time. And finally, I think in some countries, there are very strong incentives, monetary incentives, tax incentives to misclassify workers. And not just to misclassify workers, but also for workers to misclassify themselves. I mean, this is the case of the Netherlands, for example, and I'll show you this in the following graph. What we're doing here, what we did here, this is a few years old now, and so some of this might have changed a little bit, but the point is still valid. What we did here is we compared taxes and social security contributions on employees, which was the red kind of diamonds, and we compared those to different types of self-employed workers in those countries, because you often have different statuses of self-employed workers. And so we've compared the taxes and social security contributions, both employer and employee, and compared them to employees to self-employed workers. You see that in most countries, there are some differences, but they're not enormous. So in Italy, at least when we did those calculations, in Hungary, United States, in Sweden, the differences are not enormous. But there are some countries like the Netherlands and the United Kingdom where there are very large differences in taxes on these different types of employment status. So it's a no-brainer if you're a self-employed worker or if you are an employer, to try and classify someone as a self-employed person, because you are going to pay so far fewer taxes. So clearly reducing these discrepancies is very important if you want to tackle misclassification. Now, so the first goal is to try and get this group as small as possible. Try and get workers correctly classified. I feel, but I know this is not a popular opinion, and some people may disagree with me, but I think there will always be workers who will be difficult to classify. So most countries have criteria for classifying workers, and you go through the criteria and you tick them, and then you say, okay, you tick them all, you're an employee, you should be treated as an employee. My feeling is that in most countries, even when you get the classification issue right, there will always be workers where you start hesitating about, and this is why courts have had so much difficulty in classifying some of these workers in the platform economy, for example. Now, what I would argue is that right now, what happens is that these workers are left as self-employed because they're not classified as employees. They're left as self-employed and they don't have any rights and protections as a result, even though I think they have vulnerabilities. So what I would say is, yes, by all means, focus on classification, but don't forget about these workers who will find themselves in the gray zone. Think about ways in which you can extend rights and protections to these workers as well. And the first challenge here is to identify what group you're talking about. Now, in the past, countries have come up with very practical solutions to this. They have, for instance, focused on specific occupations, or they have focused on the financially dependent self-employed. So these are self-employed workers who depend for most of their income on one client. These are all valid ways of doing it. They have their strengths and benefits. At the OECD, what we've been arguing, and this goes back to the inversion of the burden of proof, is right now what happens in most countries is that you have these lists for identifying someone and seeing whether they're an employee or not. So say you have 10 criteria, you need to tick all 10 of them before you're classified as an employee. What we've been saying is, why don't we do it the other way around? Go through the criteria. As soon as you start ticking some of them, that suggests that you have some vulnerabilities. So let's try and then think what rights and protections you should be entitled to, because you clearly you have some resemblance to employees. So the second step then is to try and decide what rights and protections you're going to extend to this worker. And that's not always easy. So it may be relatively easy to extend accidents insurance or collective bargaining rights or social protection rights. And many countries have done this. They have extended those rights to those workers. It gets a little bit trickier when you start thinking about minimum wages, when you start thinking about working time. It's possible. I mean, some like New York City has introduced a minimum wage for Uber drivers. It's possible, but it's a little bit more complicated. And the third step that you may need to take is assign employer responsibilities in some cases. So for example, if you're going to extend collective bargaining rights to these workers, you need to decide who the bargaining partner is going to be. I mean, is it the platform or is it the clients? Who do they have to bargain with? If you're going to extend certain social protection rights to these workers, who is going to have the responsibility of paying and collecting social security contributions? So that's another thing that you need to sort out. Now, I want to move to the final source of vulnerability, which I think is often forgotten about in these discussions around platform workers, but also workers more broadly, I would say, who find themselves in the situation. And that's labor market monopsony. It's partly because this is a relatively new topic in labor economics. Only recently have economists started measuring this, and only recently have economists started realizing that this is a significant issue in many labor markets. I mean, labor markets are not perfectly competitive. And what happens these are situations where workers may be perfectly self-employed and perfectly classified as self-employed, and it's correct, but they don't have many outside options. They cannot just walk away and say, I'm going to find another client, I'm going to do something else. They are stuck with one or two clients who have a lot of power, and they have, as a result, very poor bargaining power. And often this is made worse for these self-employed workers because they themselves are not entitled to bargain collectively. So it makes it even more complicated. So my first point here is that for these workers, in some cases, there is an argument to extend collective bargaining rights to them. So some vulnerable own account workers, I believe that this is the case in agriculture, where some farmers can negotiate collectively because they have only a few clients who purchase their produce, so they're allowed to bargain collectively. Australia has introduced the right for small firms, own account workers, to bargain collectively. So this is already being done. Some countries have extended collective bargaining rights to some self-employed workers in the gray zone, like Germany and Sweden have done this. But this is not the only thing you can do. You can also use labor market regulation to counteract some of the negative effects of monopsony power. I mean, if you think about the minimum wage, there's a lot of research on the minimum wage that shows that the minimum wage has no effect on employment. And one of the reasons that's put forward is that these workers are often in a monopsonistic labor market where wages are being pushed down below their competitive level. So through labor market regulation, you can address some of the negative consequences of monopsony power. And the final thing you can do is, of course, address monopsony power head on. And I'm not going to talk extensively about this, but there are some platforms out there, not all, but there are some platforms out there, especially platforms who tend to be at the higher end. So for high skilled workers who have clauses in their agreements, which prohibits people from leaving the platform and working with clients outside the platform that they've met on the platform. I mean, these are kind of non-compete clauses and they're anti-competitive practices. So getting rid of these kind of clauses would be helpful. Often workers don't understand how platforms work, how the algorithms work, how their remuneration is decided upon. And this makes it very difficult for them to decide what the alternatives are. Where can I earn more or less than on this platform? And so transparency is another important issue because it increases the bargaining power of these workers. They know what they're arguing about, what they're bargaining about. And finally, one thing that can also be done is by making the labor market for these workers work better. I mean, often these workers have no outside options because they don't have skills, so they don't have the information available to look for jobs elsewhere. If you think about certain platforms, it tends to be disproportionately recent migrants who tend to work on these platforms. Why? Because the entry barriers to these platforms are low. It's an easy job to get, and they don't have many outside options. But immediately you can see how that puts them in a very poor bargaining position vis-a-vis the platform. So I've come to the end of my presentation. As a summary, thinking about these self-employed workers that are vulnerable, think very carefully about what the sources of the vulnerabilities are. Is it misclassification? Or is it that even when they're correctly classified, they have some vulnerabilities similar to employees? Or is it that they have an issue with bargaining power and they're facing a monopsonistic labor market? So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for your presentation and talking about the different sources of vulnerability. And now, in order to come to full circle, I'll leave the floor, the online floor, to Christina from the ILO. She will be talking about the universal social protection as a key driver to decent work and inclusive, resilient, and sustainable recovery.
Thank you very much, Margarita. And I thank you so much, Margarita, and thank you also to the previous speakers, Ilaria, Bettina, and Steen. I think it's really a pleasure to be here with you virtually. And I must say, after so many months of teleworking, I'm really envious about the possibility for you to meet in Bergamo. And I'm sorry that I wasn't able to join you kind of for real. So, but I'm very happy that there is the possibility actually of joining you online. And it's really a pleasure to be with you at this very, very interesting conference. And I'm very glad that also I think the presentations really complement each other well. And that makes my task really much easier, because I think the Ilaria, Bettina, and Steen have already addressed quite a number of issues that I also wanted to touch on, which is great, because then I can address them a bit more quicker. And as you can see from the photo, I would also like to take you a bit on a more global level. So also think a bit more about the global perspective for social protection. So sorry, it's always a challenge to find the right button here. So I would like to structure my presentation in three big questions. Where do we stand? What is at stake? And what needs to change? And I'm very happy that I can also bring you some of the recent deliberations and conclusions also of the International Labour Conference, which is often called the Global or the International Parliament of Labour, which is actually, and this is very unusual, we are currently, today the deliberation of the International Labour Conference has started again. Normally it happens only end of May, beginning of June. But this year, because of the virtual setting, it was decided to have another session end of November, beginning of December. And this is very timely, actually, because there's two working parties meeting at the moment, and one is on inequalities and the other one is on skills. So really kind of right in the middle of the discussion that we're having. But let me focus mostly on the question of social protection, and but I'll make some references also to the broader context. So where do we stand? And I think now, and I think several others, Bettina and also Steen have referred to the fact how much the COVID pandemic has really changed the way how people look at social protection, and also how policymakers look at social protection. And the crisis has really exposed very much the gaps in social protection systems, but at the same time, it has highlighted the key role that social protection systems play, not just in addressing crises, but also in playing a role in protecting workers and people in more general terms every day. And I think one of the key lessons learned from the crisis was how much the automatic responses have played a key role through the existing social protection system. So we have seen that countries who had good social protection systems in place were able to respond much faster and much better than countries for which this was not the case. And social protection has played a key role for protecting people's health, for protecting jobs and incomes. And I think that has come out also I think on all of the previous presentation. And it has really also played a key role as an automatic stabilizer for the economy. But at the same time, and this is basically true for almost all countries around the world, they have taken emergency policy responses to close coverage and adequacy gaps, and focusing particularly on those categories of workers who were previously not adequately protected. And depending on really the pre-existing structures, they use both social insurance and tax finance schemes to improve what they had. And that has necessitated the very urgent mobilization of additional resources and the kind of establishment of new delivery structures. Quite a lot of innovation we have seen in that context, and I think this is a very, very positive message. But at the same time, most of these measures were very temporary, and in many cases they have already ended. But that's really now also the question of what is going to happen now, as we are now at this very critical crossroads. And just to illustrate some points, and Steen has already mentioned that how much the poor social protection coverage for some categories of workers, and I'm focusing here on platform workers, using evidence from a recent ILO report. This was the ILO World Employment and Social Outlook 2021 on digital labor platforms. So that was one of the categories, but many other categories of workers have been very much affected, and were finding themselves in a very vulnerable situation. And especially those who were already vulnerable before, but for whom the crisis has even exacerbated those vulnerabilities. And this has to do, and then now I'm taking you really on a very, very global picture, and I'm sorry for the fact that the font is very small, but I'm very happy to share also afterwards the presentation with you. But the key challenge here, looking at it from a global perspective, is that less than half of the global population is effectively covered by at least a minimum of social protection. And this indicator looks at the population who's covered by at least one social protection benefit. And globally, it is 46.9% only of the global population. And if you look into some regions of the world, particularly Africa and Asia and Pacific, the proportion of those covered in at least one area is even much smaller. I mean, for example, in Africa, it's less than 1 in 5 people. And I'm not going into the detail now because of the time, but also looking at, I think it's quite interesting also to look at specific categories of the population, looking at children, looking at the situation of mothers with newborns, where only a minority are covered globally. Looking at work injury, also looking at unemployment, which has become very much to the fore in the context of the crisis, where globally only less than 1 in 5 workers receives unemployment benefits. Sorry, 1 in 5 unemployed workers receives unemployment benefits. And this is mostly due to the fact that there are many countries globally who don't even have an unemployment protection scheme. So there is a huge global challenge, but even if you look to Europe and Central Asia, the situation looks much better than in Africa and Asia and the Pacific, but even there, we see quite significant gaps in social protection coverage. And the same is true, and even more dramatically when we look, if we look at the adequacy of coverage. And if we look at the way how countries actually meet the minimum standards which are set out in international social security standards. So there is a huge challenge in that respect. And sorry, I'm skipping that slide to go right to the next one. So no, sorry. I'll just have one key message from this this section on the policy response, and this is really fact, and this is why the ILO is now in the World Social Protection Report, which has come out in September, argues that countries are at a crossroads. I mean, on the one hand, policymakers have recognized how important social protection is for keeping the social contract, basically, and but also for kind of economic dynamism in those countries. But at the same time, the fact that there are these huge coverage gaps, and there are also a number of pre-existing challenges, and they go kind of much further back than COVID-19. The labor market transformations that we have seen in recent years, which have to some extent also undermined the social contract and have fractured the social contract. And this is now a very simplistic way of putting in some of the key words. So we have seen that in many ways economic risks have been shifted to workers, also with the de-responsibilization of some enterprises. And in some sectors or in some areas of the economy, also we've seen unfair competition in that regard. We've seen the consequences and the implications of fragmentation, disempowerment, and quite often also in the discourse on social protection, we have seen that in the discourse, flexibility and security have been discussed as kind of two opposite ends of the discussion. So you can either choose social security or you can choose flexibility, but you cannot have both. And I think this is really some of the core aspects of this kind of very much fractured social contract. And so if we want to move towards a reinvigorated social contract, I think it's necessary really to put those development into question and think about ways of addressing it. And maybe starting with the last point that I mentioned, I think there is a necessity to really shift the thinking to thinking about how social security is actually necessary and indispensable to support flexibility and decent work. And I think this requires an important shift in thinking. I'm not going through the other points because I'm conscious about the time, because we want to leave some time for the discussion at the end. I think there is, and I think we have to look in a bit more kind of granularity also at what are the challenges when it comes to social protection coverage. What are the reasons for those coverage gaps? And I think Steen has already had a kind of an excellent discussion about self-employment, which quite often lacks coverage, or at least kind of lacks adequate coverage. But there are also challenges in some countries when it comes to some other forms of employment, which are sometimes being called non-standard forms of employment or diverse forms of employment. But this is not it's not a natural law. So sometimes it's being discussed as if everyone who was in temporary employment or in part-time employment was not covered. But this is certainly not the case. But there are certain elements that are really critical in that respect. For example, when we talk about temporary employment, somehow someone who has a kind of a one-year contract is in most countries quite likely to be covered. But if someone has kind of really is in very short time or very kind of casual employment, there is indeed a major challenge. And this challenge in some countries has to do with the fact that those workers are legally not covered. In other cases, it might be that they might be legally covered, but there is an issue about compliance. So I think it's really a combination of both. And we need to look very carefully because the situation of countries is very diverse. But as I said, I think the social security coverage is particularly important for workers in those forms of employment. So, and I think this really points to the need to address the non-coverage or the fact that quite often the coverage is not adequate. And so, what needs to change in that respect? And as I mentioned before, the World Social Protection Report argues about this crossroad that countries are now in after COVID-19, being aware about the very important role of social protection systems, having now a very critical policy window for making those right choices regarding the future of their social protection systems. And the question is really, are countries going to move kind of towards a high road, really towards strengthening their social protection systems, making sure that there's universal coverage for workers in all types of employment, that benefit levels and other aspects of the schemes are adequate, that there is a comprehensive range of benefits, that the social protection schemes and systems are sustainably financed and equitably financed, that there is rights-based and inclusive provision, and also that the systems adapt to developments in the world of work. So this is really the high road to social protection, really strengthening the social protection systems, which is really at the core of a human-centered recovery. But at the same time, there are pressures, and there might be, political pressures, and especially there are fiscal pressures to follow a more minimalistic approach, which we have called a kind of a low road approach, with continued underinvestment, austerity, fiscal consolidation policies, which are really kind of damage the capacity of the system to operate in an effective way, limiting the social protection systems and benefits to minimal benefits that are insufficient to ensure a dignified life for people. Forgetting about kind of the coordination with labor market, employment, and other relevant policies, which is so central, and really leading to very persistent large coverage gaps in social protection. And actually and I think there is quite some evidence to see what works and what doesn't, which of the features of schemes work and what doesn't. But I'm not going into that discussion because I'm running already late. So I'm going right to that point. And in terms of this crossroads and taking the high road versus the low road, the International Labour Conference, actually in its session in June this year, has actually come up with a very clear response to that question. And I think this is really a response that very clearly points to a high road approach to strengthening social protection systems. And I've put in the kind of the link to the conclusions that have been adopted, and also to the global call to action for a human-centered recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. So there has been a very clear call for reinforcing social protection systems and really developing universal social protection systems that do not only offer coverage for everyone, but thinking about adequate coverage and making sure that they're sustainably and equitably financed, so that they can really adequately respond to changes in the world of work and beyond, and enable people to navigate their work and life transitions, and importantly also in the context of just transitions towards environmentally sustainable societies and economies. And I think one of the critical elements that is part of that vision is ensuring adequate social protection for workers in all types of employment. And I think this very much speaks to the point that Steen has made about the self-employed workers, really making sure that the schemes, and this includes both social insurance and tax finance benefits, that they also include self-employed workers and other workers in different types of employment, so that they're really inclusive, also considering that people move between those different employment status over their time. So if you have a very fragmented system, or if you have gaps in coverage, this is really very detrimental to their protection. So it's really about extending the system and making sure that everyone is part of that system, and also contributes it to the extent possible, and benefits from the social protection system. The point about legal certainty for workers and employers has also been reflected in the conclusions, and also emphasizing also the importance of effective social dialogue, and basing the social protection systems on principles of solidarity, collective financing, well-balanced intergenerational fairness, and the achievement of gender equality. And I think it's important also to see those conclusions in a broader policy context that also looks at related policy areas, and including employment policies and regulation, including the effective regulation of labor markets, effective social dialogue, and also policies to support life and work transitions, including lifelong learning, health and care services, gender equality, and active labor market policies, and within a broader conducive policy environment. And I think at that point, I'll leave it here, and thank you very much for your attention. I've added on the last slide a number of links with further information in case you're interested. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Christina, for this insightful presentation. And thank you very much to all speakers intervening in this plenary session. We are in a conference about the value of work. So thanks again for your valuable contribution with a multidisciplinary perspective, different backgrounds, and really interesting information for all the participants. Now we have just time for a couple of remarks from the audience. If is there anyone who wants to join the podium, please. Tommaso, I know you saw I calling you by name. Briefly introduce yourself, please, and then go with the question.
So my question is referred to, to Bettina Schaller, and I will briefly introduce myself, as suggested by Margherita. My name is Tommaso, and I'm a PhD student from ADAPT, and I'm focusing my research on school-to-work transition, youth employment, and also on like how firms can increase their attractiveness, like among young people, like ready to dive into the labor market. And to come to my question, like you made the point of work shortages and as like the main issue of the labor market nowadays. And as far as I know, like this point has become popular, at least since like the McKinsey paper publication about the war for talent, triggered by like demographic as well as technological and economic changes. And probably like nowadays we are even in an even worse situation in terms of work shortages and so on. And I was really impressed by the numbers you presented about like agency work performances and agency workers outcome in the labor market. So I just wanted to ask you, like, why agency works are so effective in reading and understanding labor market trends? Like, what makes their role so crucial in like the new normal that we are like about to build. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tommaso, for this wonderful question. Also, your interest in our industry. And obviously, in the 2 or 3 minutes, it's going to be difficult. But, you know, to me, the key is this proximity to the labor market. This sector is the one that works daily with thousands of clients in literally every country of the world. And this visibility that this sector has on exactly the needs, the pain points, the requirements, but also actually the innovation that is happening allows the sector to very specifically, demand-driven, be able to respond what is needed out there. And it's obviously a model that looks at creating solutions, right? It's all about, okay, what can be done to make it work? So it's this incredible proximity to business actually and to the activity out there. What I'd like to highlight though is one key for the sector is to do things right? And I hope that this is something that came across. So this need to, when you build a solution in the labor market, it needs to, well, obviously be fully, entirely compliant with the law. It needs to be, where it is applicable, built with the social partners. It needs to be embedded into the reality of the country. And it needs to be ideally, and that's why we love to highlight the social innovation aspect. It needs to also bring new ideas and new ways of doing things. And so maybe to close off, just you mentioned the importance of well, focusing on the employability of young people entering into the labor market. I mean, we see now, we know it, the data says it. Those countries that have work-based readiness models have the lowest rates of youth unemployment, have the highest rate of youth employment participation. And so this sector that we are in as well is one of the sectors that's actually not only ensuring access of young people to the labor market, but then ensuring that their employability is really looked after. But thank you for the question again.
We have just a couple of minutes for one more question. Please.
So thank you very much for your presentation. I present myself, introduce myself. I'm Silvia Rainone. I work at European Trade Union Institute in Brussels, and I'm affiliated with KU Leuven in Belgium. Very, very engaging, interesting presentation. Thank you so much. I have a couple of questions with the time permitting for Bettina Schaller and for Steinbroek. Very interesting. And I was thinking if Bettina Schaller could, if you maybe have data on this labor market inactivity. Is there a gender divide? Is there some data about the gender? That could be interesting. And also referring to what you mentioned about the need for flexibility as an element to intrigue and trigger workers to go back to the labor market. I was wondering, what type of flexibility do you mean? Is it working hours? Is it telework? Or is more a shift towards self-employment? I was wondering that. And then for Steinbroek, I'm very interested about the labor market monopsony and the use of collective bargaining to combat and limit that. And I was wondering, is there a definition of labor market monopsony? Because for a union's perspective, it's very difficult to understand how. And now the European Commission is indeed reforming competition law. And I guess that is also a problem there. Related to that, I mean, the case could also be brought to Amazon, right? I guess Amazon is one of the target of this type of situation. And a bit similar to the farmer in the agricultural situation, we can think about transport in the transport sector. For instance, the parcel deliver that work for Amazon. Also, that I guess there is a sort of labor market monopsony dynamic, so a pressure, a compression on wages. And in that case, if we do want to apply collective bargaining, who are the bodies indeed
Are they unions? Are they small and medium enterprise? Are the unions and the medium enterprise together? I guess that's also a question now, rephrasing the paradigm for collective bargaining then. That's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Silvia. Again, great questions. And I'm actually looking at you, Christina, also on the first question you had, Silvia, on the labor market inactivity and the gender piece and whether there's data, because the ILO, of course, is one of those incredible hubs that is busy collecting exactly that data. And I believe, Christina, that one of your COVID monitoring reports focuses specifically on the women and the gender topic. So over to you just now. In our sector, we clearly see it as well, right? So women have been the first ones to drop out of the labor market, meaning that even in those sectors where work went remote and home, they couldn't carry the burden, and we all know why, right? So it is a tremendous issue. It's probably the biggest challenge that we're seeing across countries again in labor markets today, is to make sure that the women, don't continue to drop out, and then make sure that they actually come back into the labor market. Christina, over to you, maybe for some data sets and more precisions.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Bettina, and thanks a lot to Silvia for the question. Indeed, this has been really quite a global phenomenon. So women being much more likely to drop off out of the labor market so far we're not yet sure whether this is in a permanent way, but at least in a kind of a long-term and sustained way. And I think this really highlights also the importance of public services. We have seen during the COVID crisis the fact that where the kind of the education and childcare centers were closed, and this has put an additional burden on women. And despite all the progress that we have made with regard to gender equality, with regard to sharing the caring responsibilities, but we have seen that women have been really bearing the brunt of that and still have not recovered. So, and I think that makes really another important argument to really think very carefully on the combination of policies between employment policies, social protection policies, but also policies around education and services, but also training and also seeing what are, and I think skills policies are also very important in that context. So really thinking about a policy package that we need to address those challenges for a changing labor market. And back to you, Bettina.
I'll pick it up with appreciation. Thank you, Christina. So to come back, Silvia, this is data sets that are busy being collected. I actually want to invite you, when it comes to World Employment Confederation data, to subscribe to our newsletter as well, to track the website, wecglobal.org. We've got, we're tracking the effects of COVID-19 as it is. We have our social impact report that also reflects those insights, because again, we're going to have to just showcase the numbers and give visibility on this in a way unacceptable development. So maybe on your second question, what's the definition of flexibility in our case? It's actually here, if you reduce it, it has to do with the need for a labor market to recognize that there are diverse forms of work, that there are more forms of work than the open-ended direct employment relationship. And so among all those other forms of work, it is key then to have a very clear vision on, well, what are those formats, what types of benefits and security again are attributed to it. The time factor is not so much so. It's really the type of contract that we're looking at. And here we know that, again, agency work is the most secure form of flexible work. So our term and our understanding of flexibility encompasses self-employment, but not only, it's about all those different types of work. Over to you, Steen.
Yeah, just very briefly on monopsony. I'm not the monopsony expert, so I'll be very brief. I mean, if you think about monopsony, it's one buyer, right? That's very rare. So we tend to talk about labor market concentration, which tends to be when there's a few dominant firms, like dominating firms that control hiring. But the difficulty then comes, you know, in hiring in the labor market. But what is the labor market? And I think that's where the difficulty comes in: is how do you define the labor market geographically, but also what occupations, what sectors could people move to? It gets complicated, but you know, we do it for monopoly. So it should be equally possible for monopsony. And I think that just traditionally, we haven't thought about this as much as we have about monopoly. I mean, monopoly, there's consumer, you know, welfare at stake. Here, there's worker welfare at stake. And consumers are workers. So I think this is something that is possible. And, but yeah, I'm not the expert in terms of defining practically how you're going to define what cases are monopsony and what is not.
Thank you everybody for being here and also for answering the question. Unfortunately, we do not have enough time to have other contribution, but tomorrow we will have a full day, plenty of parallel workshops and the final plenary session. So I hope that you will join tomorrow the conference as well, in order to maybe networking and have different exchanges about the topics prior to the conference. So thank you again, everybody, and see you tomorrow.